It was a Thursday. We were having osso buco, which our housekeeper Rosa had spent the afternoon preparing. The table was set properly. Preston was particular about that. Candles and cloth napkins and the good china, even for family dinners, because Vivian expected nothing less. She had arrived at 6:30 sharp in a cream Chanel blazer, kissed Preston on the cheek, looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you're considering donating, and sat down at the head of my table. Not the seat I had set for her, but the head, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I let it go. I always let things go then. The conversation moved the way it always did, Vivian steering, Preston following, me contributing just enough to seem present. She talked about a property deal Preston was closing in Midtown, a mixed-use development that was going to put the Caldwell name on something new and permanent. She talked about the Caldwell Family Trust, about restructuring, about protecting assets for the next generation. She used that phrase twice, protecting assets. The third time she started to say it, she looked at me directly and said, "We need Ashley to sign some documents, just formalities." I said, "Of course, have your lawyer send them over and I'll have mine review them." Vivian's smile didn't move. "There's no need for that, it's routine." "I'm sure it is," I said. "My attorney will agree then, no problem." That's when she put her fork down, very gently, very deliberately, and she looked at Preston and said in a voice she clearly thought was too low for the study, too low for Lily, "I don't care about the child. She needs to sign what we need, and that's the end of it. Your wife is not so smart. She'll sign what we put in front of her." Preston picked up his wine glass, nodded. I picked up mine too, smiled, said nothing. But Lily heard every word, and so did I. And that was the moment I stopped being a wife and became something else entirely. Here is what those documents actually were, and why it took a panicked phone call from their own attorney 7 days later to make that clear. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the story of what I signed matters less than the story of how I got ready to sign it. That's the part they never saw coming. That's the part that changed everything. After that dinner, I went to bed beside Preston and stared at the ceiling for 3 hours. I did not cry. I had cried plenty in the years before, over smaller slights, quieter cruelties, the slow erosion of being married into a family that had never made space for you. I was done with crying. I was in a different place now, clear and cold and very, very focused. The next morning, I called my college roommate Simone, who was now a partner at a firm in Buckhead that specialized in family law and asset litigation. Simone was the kind of woman who wore 4-inch heels to depositions and had never once in her life been described as charming. I had not spoken to her in 8 months because Preston had, gradually, over the course of 3 years, made it subtly uncomfortable for me to spend time with women who were sharper than he wanted me to be. Another thing I had filed away, another thing I now retrieved. "Sim," I said when she picked up, "I need you to pull everything. Preston's business accounts, the Caldwell trust structure, any property transfers in the last 3 years. I need to know what I don't know." There was a pause. Then Simone said, "I'll call you back in 2 hours." She called back in 90 minutes. What she found should have broken me. Instead, it woke me up. Preston had been restructuring his assets for almost 2 years, quietly, methodically, piece by piece, the way you dismantle a building when you don't want anyone to notice until the whole thing is already gone. 2 LLCs had been formed in Delaware, both with names that were just random strings of letters, the kind of shell structure that is technically legal and practically invisible unless you know exactly what to look for. The Midtown development, the one Vivian had been talking about at dinner, the one she called the next chapter of the Caldwell legacy, was registered to one of those LLCs. Preston's name was on it, but buried, layered under 2 levels of corporate ownership. My name was nowhere. In Georgia, marital assets are subject to equitable distribution in divorce, but assets that are properly structured into LLCs before the filing, assets that have been moved and titled and documented in specific ways, those assets become significantly harder to claim. I am not an attorney. I was not an attorney then, but Simone was. And when she explained it to me, she used small words and a very steady voice, which told me she was angrier than she was letting on. They're building a wall, brick by brick. The documents they want you to sign, if they're what I think they are, would complete it. You'd be signing away any claim to the development, possibly to other assets tied to the trust, and there's likely language in there that would look like routine spousal acknowledgement, but would actually function as a waiver of future claims. So what do? I asked. You sign, but not what they think you're signing. And that right there, that one sentence, was the beginning of everything.
I need to tell you about the person I had been before Preston, because it matters. I grew up in Marietta, 20 miles north of Atlanta, in a house that was comfortable but not wealthy. My father ran a mid-sized logistics company. My mother taught AP English at the local high school, and they raised me to believe that the most dangerous thing a woman could be was underestimated. My mother used to say, "Let them think you're reading a magazine. Make sure you're actually reading the room." I had forgotten that. 3 years of Vivian and Preston and Tuxedo Park dinner parties and being introduced as Preston's wife rather than by my own name had sanded it down. But it had not erased it. It was still there, under the silk robe and the social calendar and the charming smile. It had just been waiting. What I did in the 6 days between Vivian's dinner and the arrival of their documents was quiet, precise, and completely invisible to anyone watching. I went to the gym as usual. I attended Lily's soccer game on Saturday and cheered from the sideline and brought orange slices like the other moms. I had dinner with Preston twice and laughed at his stories and touched his arm across the table. I was, to any observer, the perfect Buckhead wife, pliant, pleasant, and beautifully unbothered. But every night after Preston fell asleep, I sat at the desk in our home office, the one Preston used for business calls and kept locked, but whose key I had known the location of for 2 years, and I read. I read the Caldwell Family Trust documents, which were stored in a fireproof filing cabinet, alongside Preston's past tax returns, business correspondence, and a folder labeled Vivian Personal that I had never opened before. I opened it that week. What was in that folder was not about money. It was about something much older, much darker, and much more useful. Inside that folder was a real estate transaction from 2019, the year before Preston and I got married. A property in Ansley Park, a beautiful, historic home that had been purchased under the name of a woman I didn't recognize. The transaction was clean on paper, but the funding trail, when I followed it through the account numbers on the wire confirmation Vivian had inexplicably kept, led directly to the Caldwell Trust. A trust asset had been used to purchase a private residence for a private individual, which is not inherently illegal, but is certainly interesting, particularly when that individual turned out, after 40 minutes of methodical searching, to be a 31-year-old woman named Paige Whitfield, who worked as the head of marketing for Caldwell Properties and who appeared in exactly 7 photographs with Preston on his company's Instagram page, always standing close, always in the particular way that people stand when they're trying to look professional, but their body is telling a different story. I closed the folder. I sat very still for a long moment. Then I reopened it, photographed every page, emailed the photographs to Simone's secure client portal, and went to bed. I slept better than I had in months. Funny how that works. The documents arrived by courier on a Tuesday, 6 days after the dinner. A cream envelope, Vivian's signature aesthetic, with a handwritten note inside. Ashley, just a few routine items for the Caldwell estate plan. No rush, but sooner is better. V. 6 pages, dense with legal language, formatted in the way that important documents are formatted when someone wants them to look boring enough that you won't read them carefully. There was a signature line on page 4 and another on page 6. Post-it flags indicated where I should sign. I read all 6 pages, twice. The first time for comprehension, the second time to confirm what Simone had already prepared me for. The document, was, as suspected, a spousal waiver, dressed in the language of estate planning, framed as a routine acknowledgement, but functioning in practice as my voluntary relinquishment of any future claim to a list of assets, including but not limited to the Midtown development, two other commercial properties, and a fund within the Caldwell Trust, valued as of the previous quarter at just over $14 million. I poured myself a glass of Sancerre. I called Simone. I said, "Ready?" She said, "Me too." And then I signed. But what I signed was not their document. That is what their lawyer realized 7 days later when he called, and his voice was doing something voices aren't supposed to do. What I had done, what Simone had engineered with the kind of precise, brilliant, absolutely ruthless legal creativity that she had spent 15 years developing, was a counterdocument. Same formatting, same fonts, similar language, but not their document. While it appeared to acknowledge the assets in question, it actually did the opposite. It established, in language that would hold in a Georgia court, my claim to those assets as marital property, my documented awareness of the LLC structures, and my formal objection to the restructuring, timed and dated in a way that would matter enormously if we ever ended up in front of a judge. It was not fraud. Simone was very specific about that. Every word was legal. Every signature was mine and freely given. But it was a trap, and I had set it with my own hand, in my own signature, in their own cream envelope, returned by their own courier. Their attorney called on a Tuesday morning. I was at SoulCycle. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened to the message, there was that particular quality in his voice, the quality of a man who had just realized that the quiet, charming wife he had assumed was a rubber stamp had, in fact, just stamped him. I did not call back. I called Simone instead. "It worked?" I asked. "Better than worked," she said. "He called me too. They want to talk." "Tell them I'm unavailable," I said. "Tell them I'm at SoulCycle." But here's what none of them knew yet. The document was just the opening move, and I was only getting started. I want to tell you about Lily, because she is the reason I did not stop at the document. She is the reason I did not simply take what I could get and walk away quietly and let Preston and Vivian have their dynasty and their development and their Tuxedo Park dinner parties. I could have. Simone told me I had enough to negotiate a settlement that would leave me very comfortable. "You can take the money and go," she said, "or you can take everything." I thought about my daughter sitting 6 feet from that dinner table, doing her homework with the door cracked, her 9-year-old ears picking up every word of a grandmother saying she didn't care about her. I thought about Lily looking up from her math worksheet and understanding, with the terrible clarity children have, that the woman her father called his mother had just dismissed her existence. I thought about what it meant for a little girl to grow up knowing that the people who were supposed to love her had treated her like an inconvenience. I thought about my own mother, who taught AP English in Marietta, who used to say, "Let them think you're reading a magazine." I chose everything. Because some wars aren't about money. They're about making sure your daughter grows up knowing that her mother did not bow down. The week after the document panic, I began the second part of my plan. I had always been, by nature, a methodical person. It was a quality Preston had found attractive in the beginning and had spent years trying to soften out of me, encouraging me toward the kind of pleasant, surface-level existence that kept me busy and decorative and non-threatening. I had obliged for a while, but method does not leave you. It goes underground. It waits. The second part involved Paige Whitfield and the Ansley Park house. I did not confront Preston. I did not hire a private investigator, although Simone suggested it. What I did was quieter and more effective. I began attending the kind of professional events I had stopped attending 3 years ago. Industry dinners, Chamber of Commerce mixers, charity board meetings, the kinds of gatherings where Preston's professional world and my social world overlapped, where people talked, where names and relationships were currency. I dressed beautifully. and I listened carefully, and I smiled in the way that makes people want to keep talking to you. And within 2 weeks, I had confirmed, through 4 separate conversations with 4 separate people who did not know they were confirming it, that Preston's relationship with Paige Whitfield was neither new nor casual. It had started before we were married, which meant the house in Annesley Park, purchased with trust funds for a woman he had been seeing during our entire marriage, was not an affair. It was a parallel life, and I had been living in the decorative frame of it. I want to be very precise here, because this is the part where people assume I fell apart. I did not fall apart. I felt something clarify inside me, the way a photograph clarifies when the focus pulls in. Everything suddenly exact and sharp and absolutely still. I drove home from the last of those 4 conversations, past the azaleas on West Pace's ferry that were just starting to turn, past the iron gates and the manicured lawns, and all the beautiful machinery of this life I had been decorating, and I pulled into my own driveway. And I sat in my car for exactly 4 minutes, and then I went inside and I helped Lily with her science project, which was about the water cycle, which she had illustrated with remarkable accuracy and a great deal of purple marker, and I told her it was the best project I had ever seen, and I meant it. That night, after she was asleep, I went back to the desk. There were 3 more things I needed to find. 2 of them I found that night. The third one, the one that would change the entire shape of what came next, I found 4 days later, in a place none of them expected me to look. And when I found it, I understood that what Vivian had said at that dinner table, "My wife is not so smart, she will sign what we need," was not just insulting. It was the most expensive sentence she had ever spoken. Because there was one more secret, one that Preston didn't know Vivian was keeping, one that Vivian didn't know I had found. And when it came out, on a Thursday morning in a conference room in Midtown Atlanta, in front of 3 attorneys and a very uncomfortable silence, it didn't just end a marriage, it ended an empire. And it started with a house. There is a particular kind of silence that lives in expensive rooms. I know it well by now. The silence of Vivian's Tuxedo Park dining room, the silence of Preston's office when he was on calls he didn't want me to hear, the silence of a marriage held together by social currency and square footage and a shared performance we had both agreed to maintain without ever discussing the terms. But the silence I walked into on that Thursday morning in the conference room on the 34th floor of a building on Peachtree Street was a different animal. It was not decorative silence. It was the silence of people who had just understood that they were not the ones in control of this room. I had dressed carefully, ivory blazer, tailored, dark trousers, my mother's pearl earrings, not because I needed the armor, but because I wanted to remember who taught me to fight. Simone was beside me, and she was wearing the 4-inch heels, and she had a face that could have been carved from particularly expensive stone. Preston was already seated when I walked in. He looked at me the way you look at a weather forecast that wasn't what you expected, with that particular blend of confusion and dawning concern. Vivian was to his left, pearl necklace in place, posture impeccable, expression controlled, except for the slight tension around her eyes that told me she'd been up most of the night. Their attorney, a man named Bryce Holloway, who came very highly recommended and had until approximately 7 days prior believed this was the simplest paperwork he had touched all year, was seated at the head of the table, looking like he would very much like to be somewhere else.
"Ashley," Preston said. "Preston," I said. I sat down. And right then, right at that exact moment, I watched Vivian Caldwell realize that she had made a very serious miscalculation. Let me tell you about the 4th thing I found. The 3rd one had been simple enough. Bank records Simone had subpoenaed through the discovery process, confirming that trust funds had been used for the Annesley Park property, which was the kind of financial impropriety that tends to make trustees and estate attorneys very nervous. The 4th thing was different. The 4th thing was something that had nothing to do with Preston. It was about Vivian, and it was about a name, Thomas Reed, who had appeared twice in the folder labeled Vivian Personal and whom I had initially dismissed as a business contact. I had come back to him 4 days after the SoulCycle call, driven by the kind of methodical instinct that you develop when you've spent weeks reading documents at 2 in the morning. Thomas Reed was not a business contact. Thomas Reed was Vivian's son, not Preston's brother, not a public Caldwell, a private one, the product of a relationship that had predated Vivian's marriage to the late Gregory Caldwell by approximately 8 months, a relationship that had been buried so completely that it existed only in a private document of paternity acknowledgement, a trust disbursement record from 2003, and an old letter in Vivian's own handwriting that she had, with remarkable carelessness, filed behind a property deed in her own personal cabinet, and that I had photographed on the 3rd night of my desk sessions. Thomas Reed had been quietly receiving disbursements from the Caldwell Trust for 20 years, not large ones, calibrated, I suspected, to stay below the threshold that would trigger questions, but consistent. And the reason they had to stay quiet was that if Thomas Reed were acknowledged as a Caldwell heir, which legally he was, the trust structure changed, the asset distribution changed, the entire financial architecture that Vivian had spent 30 years building would have to be renegotiated, and the people who would benefit most from that renegotiation would not be Preston, they would be me and Lily. Because here's what Vivian had never told her own son. The trust document she had written so carefully, the one that defined direct heirs of the Caldwell line, had a clause that even Bryce Holloway hadn't noticed until Simone pointed to it like she was identifying a body. I'll try to translate the legal language without losing the part that matters. Gregory Caldwell's original trust, drafted in 1987 before anyone had anticipated the complexity that was coming, defined direct descendants broadly. It used language that, under Georgia law and with a verified paternity document, could and would include an unacknowledged biological child of Vivian's, because Vivian herself was named as the originating trustee, and her biological children were listed as primary heirs without restriction. She had written it that way because in 1987 she had no reason to believe it would ever matter. Thomas Reed had been a secret she considered fully contained. She had been wrong. Because if Thomas Reed was acknowledged, and Simone had already prepared the filing, the trust couldn't be restructured without his consent. The Midtown development, the $14 million fund, the commercial properties, the Ansley Park House, none of it could be cleanly transferred or protected without a full trust reformation that would require every heir's signature, including Thomas's. And Thomas, when Simone's office had reached him 2 weeks earlier with a carefully worded letter explaining that he had potential legal standing in an estate matter, had been, let's say, receptive.
I watched Bryce Holloway read Simone's brief. I watched his eyes move quickly at first, and then slow down in the particular way eyes slow down when they're reaching something they didn't expect. I watched him set the brief on the table and look at Vivian with an expression that was trying very hard to remain professional. Vivian was already looking at me. That was the moment, that right there, when Vivian Caldwell looked at me across that conference room table and understood that the woman she had dismissed in her own dining room, the woman who was not so smart, had, in the space of 3 weeks, found the one secret that could unravel everything she had ever built. "You need to understand something," Vivian said, and her voice was steady. I'll give her that. Vivian had a spine made of something unbreakable, which I had always known. "Whatever you think you've found." "I don't think anything," I said. "Simone, do you want to take it from here?" Simone took it from there. She spent 22 minutes outlining in the precise and devastatingly pleasant voice she used in depositions exactly what we had found, exactly what it meant legally, and exactly what we were prepared to do with it. The counter document, the trust clause, Thomas Reed's standing, the Ansley Park funding trail, the LLC structures and the asset transfers, and the timeline that demonstrated clearly and provably that the restructuring had begun, she paused for effect here, the way she always did in courtrooms, approximately 6 weeks after Preston had first consulted a divorce attorney. 6 weeks before he had told me anything was wrong. I watched Preston look at the table. It was the look of a man who had told himself a story about who he was and was watching the ending change. And I had a decision to make, because I had not come to that conference room to destroy Preston. I had come to do something much more deliberate. Here is the thing about revenge that nobody tells you. The unsophisticated version of it is designed to hurt the other person as much as possible. The sophisticated version is designed to correct an imbalance. It is not about pain, it is about equity. It is about standing in a room where someone planned to take everything from you and leaving with more than they intended you to have, not by stealing, not by screaming, but by being more prepared, more informed, and more clear-eyed than anyone else in the space. I did not want to burn Preston's life down. I wanted to rebuild mine. There's a difference. What I wanted was outlined in the document Simone slid across the table after her 22 minutes were up. Full equity in the Midtown development, which would be transferred to an LLC in my name. The $14 million trust fund dissolution, split equitably with Thomas Reed per legal standing, which left me with $7 million in liquid assets. The Buckhead house, which was in both our names, and which I intended to keep, because Lily's school was nearby, and she had her friends there, and she had already had enough disrupted. Child support calculated on Preston's full income, not the income the LLC restructuring had been designed to obscure. And one more thing, the last line of my document, the one that made Bryce Holloway look up from the page with an expression I will not forget. A public acknowledgement in the form of a recorded deed transfer that the Ansley Park property, purchased with trust funds for Paige Whitfield during our marriage, was a marital asset and would be liquidated as part of the settlement, with proceeds going into Lily's education trust. I let that one land.
Preston closed his eyes, and Vivian, who had sat at my dinner table and said she didn't care about the child, put her hands flat on the conference table like she needed something solid beneath her. "You don't have to do this publicly," she said, and for the first time since I had known her, there was something underneath her voice that was not composure. It was not quite fear. It was the specific vulnerability of a woman who had built everything on control and was watching control leave the room. "I'm not doing it publicly," I said. "I'm doing it legally. There's a difference, which you know, I think, better than anyone." She looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. I thought about Lily doing her homework 6 feet from that dining table. I thought about purple marker and the water cycle. I thought about my mother in Marietta, reading the room while everyone else thought she was reading a magazine. "What do you want?" Vivian said. "Everything on that page," I said, "and I want it done in 30 days. She signed. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks after the conference room, because the story doesn't end with signatures and it doesn't end with settlement numbers. It ends with a Tuesday in November, 5 weeks after that meeting, when I picked Lily up from school in the car I had bought with my own money, a white Range Rover, because I wanted something that was mine, just mine, nothing shared and nothing gifted. And she climbed into the passenger seat and looked at me with those sharp, clear eyes she'd had since she was an infant. "Mom," she said, "are we going to be okay?" I had been waiting for this question. I had been thinking about how to answer it since the night Vivian said what she said at the dinner table, since the moment I decided that Lily would not grow up watching her mother be managed. "Yeah," I said, "we're going to be better than okay." She was quiet for a minute, the way she is when she's processing something important. Then she said, "Did you do something?" I laughed. I couldn't help it. She was 9. She was a 9-year-old who understood that something had shifted, who had inherited my mother's instinct for the room. "I did several things," I said. "Do you want to hear about them?"
Not the boring parts, she said. Just the good parts. I told her the good parts. The Buckhead house sold 4 months later, not because I had to sell it, but because I chose to. It was too large for what we were becoming, and it had too many rooms that smelled like a life I was no longer living. I bought a home in Virginia Highland instead, smaller, warmer, a front porch and a real backyard, and a kitchen with windows on 3 sides that let in so much light that Rosa, who had come with me because she said she had never worked for anyone she respected more, cried a little the first time she cooked breakfast there. I did not cry. I drank my coffee and watched the light come through the windows and felt something I had not felt in years. I felt like myself. The Midtown development, which I now had equity in, closed on its first 2 commercial tenants in February and generated revenue that I will not quote because I have learned not to make numbers the point of the story. The point of the story is that I had been the kind of woman who was described as charming, and I had let that description become a box, and I had lived in the box for 3 years. And then, one Thursday night, at a dining room table in Tuxedo Park, I heard the wrong person say the wrong thing about my daughter. And I got out of the box. Thomas Reed, for what it's worth, turned out to be a landscape architect in Decatur, quiet and careful and utterly blindsided by the legal correspondence that had arrived in his life. We met once, for coffee, at a place on Ponce de Leon. He was nothing like Preston. He looked like his mother in the way that people looked like the parts of their parents that were never quite tamed. He was owed what he was owed, and he got it, and we shook hands at the end of our coffee and went back to our separate lives. Vivian retired from her public board positions in the spring, quietly, without announcement. The social pages did not note it as anything significant. I noticed. Preston married Paige Whitfield 11 months after our divorce was finalized. I know this because Lily mentioned it and because it appeared in a brief item in the Atlanta Business Chronicle that I read once and did not read again. I felt nothing in particular about it, which was its own kind of peace. The woman they built the trap for walked in and sprung it herself, and then she walked out and built something new. Here is the moral, if you are looking for one, though I resist the idea that the point of any story is a lesson neatly packaged for consumption. But if I had to say it plainly, I would say this: the most dangerous thing you can do to a woman who has been underestimated is assume that she will stay that way. Underestimation is a gift, if you know what to do with it. It buys you time. It keeps people talking when they should be quiet. It lets you sit at a dining room table and smile and say nothing and file everything away in that quiet mental drawer. And then one night you go to the desk and you open the drawer and you find out exactly how much you have been given. I have been given a lot. Lily is 10 now. She is in the 4th grade and she has joined the school debate team, and she has an opinion about everything, and she gets it from both sides. My mother's precision and whatever it is in me that would not lie down. She does not know everything yet. She knows that her mother fought. She knows that fighting smart is different from fighting loud. She knows that the woman who said she didn't care about her is no longer a presence in our lives, and she has never asked me to explain why, and I have never offered, because some things are not stories for children, and some things are simply the clean air after a storm. On the first Sunday after we moved into the Virginia Highland house, I cooked breakfast myself, Rose's day off, and I made eggs and toast and orange juice from actual oranges, the kind you squeeze by hand, and Lily sat at the kitchen island in her pajamas with her hair undone and the light coming through all 3 sides of windows, and she said, in the matter-of-fact voice she uses for things that are important, "I like this house better." "Me too," I said. "It feels like us," she said. "It does." My name is Ashley Reeves Caldwell, and I was the kind of woman Atlanta society pages called charming, and for a while I let that be enough, and then I stopped. The kitchen I stand in now cost considerably less than $4.2 million, and the silk robe I wear in it is mine, paid for with money I earned. And when I pour my coffee in the morning and the light comes through those windows, there is nobody in this house who underestimates me. Not anymore. Not ever again.
Take a moment to comment your city or country. I love connecting with you all. Thank you for listening and supporting, and be sure to subscribe for more stories. More are coming your way soon. Until next time, stay kind to yourself and stay strong.